I want you to imagine this morning that you're on your way to church. You're driving in your vehicle. You're about to turn in and park when suddenly you get a text message. Ding. And you look at it because the news is spreading rapidly. You look at that text message and you find out that one of your pastors is in jail. Can you imagine? Well, you go on up to choir practice or you go on into your Sunday school class and you realize nobody's paying attention to the Sunday school lesson because all that people can talk about is that one of their pastors is where? In jail. Now, you don't know where or you don't know why and you don't know the exact circumstances, but that's what everybody's talking about in church. And so you go on in a dutiful way and you gather for worship, and the sermon, guess what, falls on deaf ears because all you can think about is one of your pastor who is where? In jail. And that's the backdrop. That is the context for our letter today. 3 times, if you read the original translations, 3 times Paul is going to mention that he is in chains. And again, we don't know where, but tradition says he's in prison where? Does anybody know? Rome. That's what is the more common interpretation, but it doesn't say in the letter, so we have to guess that he's probably in Rome. We don't know if he's in a cell, a dark, dank cell, with just a little bit of light, with rats running around everywhere. You get the idea. We don't know if he's under house arrest. Some people think that. We don't know. All we know is that he is in prison, which means no privacy, no conveniences, no freedom. He's under attack. He's waiting trial. And his life, his very life, is on the line. And that, to me, is what makes many of his letters, but this letter in particular, Philippians, it's so remarkable to me, and it makes this letter so distinctive, that even as Paul is in prison, his life is on the line, that there's so much joy in the letter. If you read it or reread it, you'll notice that the joy overflows, so much so that this letter almost sparkles. It almost sparkles. It shines like the stars, which is what Paul says about the people of Philippi. He's writing this letter from prison to the church of Philippi. He says that they shine like the stars. You know, they're living in a, much like today, a world that I think you brought up, Christy, in your prayer, that is spiraling into chaos, and it's filled with injustice and corruption. And Paul says of this church that you, in a world of corruption, shine, Philippi. You shine like the stars, which is why Eugene Peterson, one of my favorite Bible scholars, he's joined the Church Triumphant. He says of this letter, Philippians, that this, now there are a lot of Pauline or letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And he says this is Paul's what? Happiest letter. It just sparkles. There's this warmth to it and this affection. And something that I want to say is that I believe, not just me, other commentaries say this, out of this happiness, you know, you see a church that is exemplary in living out the gospel. Now, when you read other letters of Paul, he's writing and he's kind of scolding them, or he's, you know, telling them to shape up because, you know, they're like a problem. It's like you're the problem child. Well, that's not the case here with Philippians. This is a church that over time has learned to embody the gospel, and so in a world of darkness, they shine like the stars. So what I thought I would do as I walk us through this letter is I want to look at this church in Philippi and what Paul has to say to them in this letter, because I think this letter has something to teach us about what it means as a congregation to trust God. all right? And for those of you who like to count as we go along, there are going to be 5 characteristics from this church and Paul's letter that I want us to think about as we as a congregation seek to trust God with our lives. And the first characteristic of this church or teaching in the letter, and it is the heart of the entire letter. It's in the 2nd chapter, and it's referred to as the Christ hymn. But Paul is reminding this church, this ancient church, to imitate Christ. And not just Christ, but imitate Christ's humility. He says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. My translation says, adopt the attitude that was in Christ Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave. He was humble. He was a human. He became human. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of what? Death on a cross. Let the same attitude, mind, be in you that was in Christ Jesus. You know, humility was not a virtue in the ancient world. It's not really a virtue in the public sphere today, is it? But it was considered something reserved for slaves or servants. It was a posture or a poise or an attitude of inferiority. And something that made Christianity distinctive is humility and following in the likeness of the humility of Jesus Christ. The other thing I want to say is that we are mimetic beings. Now, that's a big word. What it means is we imitate. That's how we learn things. It's by imitating. If whatever you're wearing today, however you choose your style, you probably learned that from someone at an early age or whenever, and you're imitating that person. We tend to imitate those persons we admire. We do it, whether we are conscious of it or not just children, but even as adults. And Paul here is reminding us, if we want to know how to trust God as a congregation and trust God with our lives, we will imitate Christ and Christ's humility. The second characteristic of this church that you see, and this is radical, it'll be radical today, it was radical then, is their unity. This is what it means to be a church that trusts God. We are unified. A little bit about Philippi here. Philippi was the first church that Paul founded in Europe on his second missionary journey. So, first Christian church that we know of on the continent of Europe. And it was part of ancient Macedonia, which means it was part of what today would be modern-day Greece, but it was a Roman colony. So there was a lot of opposition. The philosophy and the practice of the Church of Philippi clashed with the Romans. And so this church was made up of people. It was very diverse. And all these backgrounds and different socioeconomic statuses. There was a lot of different cultures, a lot of different beliefs, a lot of different ethnicities. Gender was a part of the diversity. So it was incredibly diverse, but it was unified. We say that. It's not, there's a difference between uniformity and unity. They weren't uniform, they were unified. And one of the reasons Paul gives in this letter for this church's unity is that they had been through struggle. You know, a church, I learned this a long time ago. You don't want the enemy to be in the church. You know, you don't want your struggle and your turmoil to happen within. You want the enemy or the challenge to be on the outside, because that will unify you. I think about our country. We are struggling within. That's the worst kind of struggle, because it divides you. If we want to know how to trust God out with our lives, we will be unified. But this church wasn't perfect. I think it was exemplary in trusting God, but I don't think it was perfect, and it wasn't perfectly unified. I'm sure you've heard of these two women, and Paul is going to bring up, he's going to name them, and the two women are Euodia, and I always struggle with this one, Syntyche. Is that right? Carter Bice isn't here to correct me, so we're going to go with that. And by the way, Joel, you did a wonderful job. Where are you? Over here. I don't have my glasses on, but you did a wonderful job. There you are. Reading, but I didn't have you read that particular section, so you didn't have to struggle with those names. You can thank me later or fill out that pledge card. You know. I'm not just picking on Joel either. That's for all of you. Paul is going to mention these two women, and he mentions them why? Do you know the reason? They're struggling with each other. And so in his letter, Paul is going to urge them to sort it out, you know, because unity is so important for a mature church, a church that embodies the gospel and learns to trust God. Be of the same mind, he says. Now, lots of ink has been spilt over this, and I know that y'all know I'm a feminist, which just means I care about the equal rights of men and women. It doesn't mean I'm crazy or anything. Well, some of you may think so. So it's been off-putting to me when people have made jokes about these two women. You know, what's remarkable is that they're mentioned, and they're given a name, and that Paul is so concerned about them. Now, we don't know a lot about them in this small, section of this letter, but what we know is that they have been leaders in the church. And Paul says that he worked alongside them for the good of the gospel and the work and labor of the gospel. And the echoes go all the way back to Acts, where we learn about Philippi. It's just getting its feet on the ground. The first convert to Europe, Christian convert in Europe, was what? A woman. And her name is Lydia, one of the first converts. And this is how Philippi, the church of Philippi, gets started. And so the takeaway, and I have to go here, the takeaway I have as I think about this church and what a church does when it learns to trust God, a church that trusts God elevates women into leadership. Women are in leadership. Thanks be to God for a place where Jill and I can lead and serve on behalf of the gospel. Give yourselves a hand. And then the other characteristic, we're on number 3, by the way, is a church that trusts God and is exemplary in living out the gospel, is a generous church. Now, you knew I had to go here. It's stewardship. First Sunday of stewardship season, you had to know I was going to talk about money, right? People get really nervous during stewardship. I've had people, I see you out there rolling your eyes, not any of you. I'm just talking, in themes here, not in generalities here. I know some people avoid church altogether during the end of October when we talk about this topic. But to me, I would like to hear less talk about money outside of the church and more talk about money inside of the church, because we know what to do with it. You see, the Bible gives us an ethic, a gospel ethic, and we know what to do with our resources. We're to take care of one another, take care of everyone. And Jesus says, especially in the Old Testament too, to take care of the least of these, the downtrodden, those who are forgotten by the world. When you have done it, Jesus says, unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. We don't have to scratch our heads on this one when reading the Bible. We don't have to wonder, oh gosh, wonder what I should. No, we know what to do with our resources. The gospel and the Bible tells us so. Well, in this case, the person in need is Paul because he's in jail. And prison wasn't like prison is today, at least in this country, where you got your basic needs met. In those days, if you didn't have someone on the outside there to provide you with resources, things like food and extra fresh clothing and maybe a blanket or two, then you're going to starve to death or freeze to death. I want you to see what happens here. The church of Philippi steps up. I want you to just think about how generous they are here. There's a man by the name of Epaphroditus. I guess that's how you say it. And he says, I'll go. And so the church takes up a collection of money, we're talking money here, and other goods and resources, and Epaphroditus takes this long journey to deliver it and to take care of Paul in jail. Now, you need to know, though, we don't know where he was, but let's just go with the traditional interpretation that he's in jail in Rome. That's 600 miles as a crow flies. And they didn't have Venmo back in that time, so you couldn't type in the amount. Probably Epaphroditus has to get on his own 2 feet, walk most of the way, and then we learn in this letter, the details are there, that he is sick. He gets sick while he's there taking care of Paul, so sick that he almost dies, but he doesn't. He makes it back. Now, just imagine for a moment. Let me put this in perspective. Let's say Leslie Vaughn, very generous, one of the most generous persons I know. She happens to be over the staff person who handles and takes care of, with other laity, our finances. Let's give a hand for Leslie Vaughn. Now, because she's so generous, Doug, her husband, imagine if she says, I'll go. And she doesn't just go to Biloxi, to our accountant. She goes all the way to wherever, let's say Rome. That's where Paul is in jail. And probably had to go on foot, almost gets sick and dies. And we have to go along to get along without Leslie for all that time. Can you imagine? Generous. It was a generous church. And Philippi, we know this from other books or letters of Paul in the New Testament, Philippi was not a big, wealthy church like, well, we won't name those other churches. You know, they were small in number, we're told, and they barely got by at times. Their means were modest, and yet they were extravagant in their generosity. And Paul is grateful. So he spends this last chapter saying, thank you to this church. He even points out that of all those churches that he helped plant, this was the only one. Philippi was the only one. No church shared in supporting my ministry, he writes, except you. And then he describes their support as a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. A church that trusts God, that shines like the stars, is a church that is what? You can say it. Generous. And finally, I'm on number 5 if you're counting. I do agree with Eugene Peterson that this is one of the happiest letters in the entire New Testament that is attributed to Paul. And I have to believe, because it's so full of warmth and appreciation and gratitude, happiness, that Philippi, that little church, humble church, that it was a happy church. And so I think if we're going to learn to trust God with our lives, that we need to be what? Happy. It's okay to say that in church. Be happy. And the way that Paul says it is rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord when? Always. Again, I say rejoice. And I looked up the word. It's in the Greek. I don't read Greek. I just looked up. I know how to look these words up. And it actually means, the word happy here is satisfy, content. Makes me think about a story, and then I'm going to land the plane, I promise. It's about a pilot, by the way. A pilot is flying his plane overhead. And every single time he flies over this particular valley in the Appalachian region, every single time he would look down intently. One day, the co-pilot asked him, "Why? Why do you look down when we fly over here every single time? What is so special about that particular spot?" And the pilot said, "You see that stream over there, down there? When I was a little boy, I would sit on a log and I would fish in that stream. And when I would hear a plane going overhead, I would look up and I would wish I were flying. And now, when I look down, I wish I were fishing." This time of year, I'm often asking myself, what will satisfy me? When is enough enough? I'll look at my retirement. Do I have enough saved up? Am I doing okay? I'll even ask people, you know who you are, what do you think? When's enough? And then it'll come time to fill out my commitment card. And I'll write the figure in and I'll say, "Good grief, I'm the pastor of this church. I've got to model faithfulness. Is this enough? When is enough enough?" The most hopeful word in the entire letter is learned. Paul says, "I have learned the secret to being content in every and any circumstances." He goes on to say, when my needs are met and when my needs are not met, when I'm filled, when I'm not filled, when I'm hungry, when I'm satisfied, all these circumstances, in jail, not in jail, you get the idea. I have learned to be content. I want you to hear the good news here. We don't have to have this trust God, this let go and let God. We don't have to master it. We just have to be willing to learn. And my, oh my, you know why I invest in this church? You've taught me so much, so much about what it means to trust God with my life. And it's not something you can force or impose. It just kind of bubbles up, which is why Paul calls it a secret. Over time, when you lean into community and you lean into the Spirit, over time, something within you begins to emerge and blossom. And we call it Christ. I don't know about you, but I am glad, super glad, that Paul wrote this letter, because as I, along with you, am learning to trust God, I need the reminder that my God, your God, our God will meet, as Paul writes, all our needs according to God's riches in glory in Christ Jesus. So be it, and so it is. Amen.